welcome to the Building on a Budget video series. In this series of videos, I will help you choose which boxes you will need to build a competitive list for the keyword of your choice. Now, each of these videos is focused on a specific faction, so obviously watch the one that is associated with the faction that you are interested in. Then, of course, we'll go through each keyword and I'll give you which boxes that I think are good starting boxes for that keyword. Now, the goal of each of these sets is to make a competitive list with some flexibility if possible. But also keep in mind we are on a budget, so that definitely changes some of the choices that I would suggest to somebody that could just buy the entire faction, of course. So we're going to focus on trying to buy ideally 2 or 3 starting boxes, and then I give you suggestions on how to expand from there and what boxes I would recommend. Now, each of the lists that I give you tend to focus on that keyword and good versatile models. I tend to avoid taxed-in models, and I tend to avoid out-of-faction models that are within that keyword. Now, obviously, if the model comes with the master box, then I'm not so worried about that. But I avoided models that you have to buy an out-of-faction box and get a bunch of out-of-faction models just for that specific model more often than not. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule just because the power of that specific model is just really needed to make a list very competitive. But if I could avoid doing that, I definitely did so just for budgetary reasons. Now, of course, these are all my preferences. A lot of people will argue a lot of these, and when I submitted these to the public at large, there was a lot of debate as to which boxes were better or worse. But I tried to adhere to these 4 principles when in doubt. So everything I suggest here, you can always take with a grain of salt, and you should do your own research if you're not sure about it. Now, as far as the pricing, I use everything from the Weird store, and I'm also not accounting for any older boxes, no M2E or M1E versions of the models, because you may be able to find those, but not everybody will be able to find those. So everything is based on the M3 boxes primarily. Of course, if you can find the older boxes or find individual models, you of course can get quite a deal and start your keyword a lot more cheaply if you want it. Now, as far as the actual list, it's essentially, I have them sectioned off by colors. The green models are, or the green boxes I should say, are the ones that you will need to start the list. You need these to make a full 50 soulstone list, and these are the ones I think are the best picks. Obviously, the first box is always the master box because you'll need that model on its totem. And then I suggest what I think is probably the best box to help fill the master box and make a 50 soulstone crew. In some cases, it's more than just one model just because you didn't have enough models to make a 50 soulstone list. In some cases, others, it really, really helps to have a couple other options, as the case may be, because maybe the box models are not that good, and I really don't recommend taking those in some cases. The yellow ones are the secondary purchases. These generally really increase the power level and give you a lot of good options to expand this crew or just make it really tuned. So these are the ones I would definitely recommend next. These are in order of purchasing as far as my preference. You can obviously get them in a different order if you feel like certain ones are more vital to how you play, but that's generally how I establish those, is the best to the worst as far as what will bring you the most power to that crew. Next up, we have the orange boxes. These are designed to add a lot of flexibility. These tend to be models that you don't need, but they will definitely help in the right circumstances or the right scheme pools. Things that you don't necessarily need and you can hold off on getting, but they're definitely going to help you cover the gamut of scheme pools, basically. And then finally, the red. The red options are purely optional. Red does not mean they're bad models. It does not mean they're not great models and can make really powerful lists using them. But red generally means these are things that are in the keyword or versatile models that are left that I feel like you don't really need them necessarily to make a really, really good list. So these are very optional. If you think a specific model is great for your playstyle, then by all means go get it. But these are ones that I think you can avoid. All right, so with that said, let's get into the list. For the Amalgam keyword, we have Leviticus's core box. We first go into Marlena as the next box. Marlena has a good ranged attack, a good melee attack, and primarily the thing she is doing is whenever Levi hurts himself, she is instead going to take the damage because of her ability. So, very useful ability for Levi to keep him alive longer. And it also works with the other models that are not minions. Then we go to Desolation. This gives you the Desolation engine and the Abominations. This box you're taking in particular because Abominations can be summoned by Levi and it's a built-in trigger, so you kind of need this box, otherwise it's going to feel real bad when you can't actually summon an A-bomb because you don't have the model. So, had to include this one just because of how Levi works. Now, the Deso engine is not a bad beater model anyways. It is pretty low statted as far as defense, but you can keep it alive, especially if you are able to add the Terrifying upgrade that makes it Terrifying 13. I believe that's Servant of Darker Powers. All in all, this crew has a lot of card manipulation because of the scavengers, and it has some hitting power because Levi, Rusty, and the Deso can all hit pretty hard. Expanding from there, we go with Ashes and Dust, who got a little bit of a nerf again. He's been hit a couple times, so you'll definitely want to grab the newer card for him. But he still splits apart and can reform, so he's hard to put down because of his mechanics, and he's just a really fast model. So you can use him to go into the enemy crew and do some damage, or to scheme run. He's pretty versatile as far as what you can actually use him for. Then, of course, we have the Necropunks. Also got hit a little bit with a nerf, but they're still a solid backfield schemer. Definitely worth taking. Probably not two of anymore, but one of is always of consideration. Then going into the orange choices, we have Hodgepodge Fate, and you'll find this is pretty universal when it comes to Outcast. Hodgepodge Fate always has a place in almost every list. That's because the Emissary is such a good piece. It is a great healer. It is a great buffer because it puts out trinkets that gives things Don't Mind Me, Regen, or Companion, I believe. And it's also a good scheme runner of his own as long as you can get him up the field. He's more of a midfield scheme runner. He's not so much a deep scheme runner, but a great piece that can probably fit into most crews. For the Bandit keyword, we of course start with Parker's box, and then we go into the Folsom Prison Blues. This is going to give you Sue, who can do some phenomenal damage. He can also do some card draw. He also has some utility, so a good all-around piece. And then you have the Convict Gunslingers. These guys are probably a little overpriced for what they are, but they're still a fine model. This starting list has a lot of reach because you have Running Gun, you have Fast, so you're able to affect a lot of the board. Just be mindful that a lot of concealment on the table will be annoying, even though most of your crew effectively ignores it with the plus flips. You'd rather just have a plus flip on the shot because they're a little bit lower statted shots. Then when you're ready to expand from there, you have Hodgepodge Fate, which, as we mentioned, the Hodgepodge Emissary is just a really good healer, a really good schemer, a decent buffer, a lot of things going on there. Then we go to Paid in Blood. This is for the Midnight Stalker primarily. The Midnight Stalker combos well with Parker because he is a backfield scheme runner, and whenever Parker shoots somebody, he can discard a card to make the Stalker take an interact. So a lot of times the Stalker gets in the backfield and then Parker starts shooting, which is what he does, and then drops a bunch of markers with the Stalker or picks up symbols or whatever you need to do in the backfield as far as interacting. Then we have the Woko Raiders. These guys are pretty good mid-range beaters. They are one model that doesn't really have ranged attacks in this crew, but they do have pretty good melee attacks, and they can't be cheated against when they are being attacked by melee. They also have some scheme marker manipulation because they can move scheme markers if you hit the right suit, I believe. Finally, into the orange boxes, we have the Dead Outlaws. These are another way to get fast, especially for like Sue, who can't innately do it because he doesn't have that ability. They're also fairly well costed for their price, just because they're fairly tough and they can hit decently. Pretty good overall model, not one you need, but a good filler, especially since it's a little bit cheaper than a lot of the other models in the crew. You also do have the Bayou Smugglers. They are red. The main reason why is I don't think you really need them, but they can give you some interesting tricks you can do or give you more resource generation if you want. Not a bad model, but I don't think it's necessary by any means. For the Freikorps, we of course start with Von Schill's box, and the first box you'll go for is Between the Ley Lines. This is going to give you 2 Librarians, which are great healers. They're also decent damage dealers. They can also move your other models around. They can draw you some cards if you hit the triggers. Pretty good mid-range model. And then of course you have Hannah, who is probably the main reason you're taking this box. She is just a fantastic piece. She gives you Arcane Reservoir. She can copy other models' abilities, at least other Freikorps abilities. And she can do the mythical high damage of, I believe, 9 or 10 damage on her top end with her punch if you have focus and if you're hitting the double crit strike and stuff like that. So she can hit really hard. She's fairly tough, and she just brings some utility to the crew. The starting list here is going to have a lot of hitting power, and then of course the librarians that help keep them up. So it's fairly tanky starting crew, so good for just brawling it out in the middle and trying to outlast the opponent. Then when you're ready to move into the yellow boxes, I recommend starting with the Outcast starter box. Now, I will put a minor disclaimer in that this box has not been released as of the recording time, and the models are technically subject to change, but I don't think they'll change that much. The Catalan Rifleman and Yannick and Waller are okay pieces, but the Brawler is the real reason you want to bring this thing. It's a good, punchy model. It can give you extra shots, which Von Schild has a great gun, and he can also make the crew more tanky because they have to hit him instead of your other models, which is great with librarians because they can just hit him and then heal off the damage. Going from there, we have Cutting Edge Technology, which gives you Lazarus and 2 Engineers. The Engineers are the main reason you want this box. They are great backfield support pieces. They can buff your other models. They have anti-armor attacks. Lazarus is fine. Just be mindful, shockwaves are kind of hit and miss, and the crew doesn't necessarily have a lot of other shockwaves or a lot of other ways to attack the opponent's hands. Shockwaves are really good when you can do them in bulk, and when you only have one model that's doing it, it's not necessarily as good, but it is 3 damage, so people are more likely to cheat it out. Moving from there, we have the Hodgepodge Fate. Of course, we've talked about the Emissary several times, but just a more expensive but good support piece and Scheme Runner. Moving from there, we have the orange boxes. You have Auxiliary Forces, 2 Draka Troopers in this, and 3 Scouts. The Troopers are okay models. They are blasting. They do a lot of burning tricks. They can get rid of conditions for you, but they're maybe a little overcosted for what they do. You can occasionally bring in one, but it's going to be more of a tech piece, I think. Then the Scouts are snipers. They are map dependent. There are going to be maps where they're going to be fantastic, and there are going to be some maps where you just leave them at home. That's why they are orange. Finally, you have Paid in Blood. This is because the Midnight Stalker again gives you a backfield Scheme Runner, which this crew tends to lack. You don't have anything else that can really do it. I mean, you can give things rocket boots, but it's better to just do it with a Stalker, I think. And then Hans is also not a bad combo sniper, especially if the board is open to it. You can actually bring a decent gun line with Scouts and Riflemen and Hans. You actually have like a long range gun. I wouldn't recommend it very often, but there are some maps that it may work out for you. For the infamous keyword, we start with Captain Zip. Now, small disclaimer, the first few boxes in here are Bayou boxes, which you won't be able to use with other Outcasts, so you may want to hold off on Zip until later in your Outcast career if that's going to be an issue. But the first box is Pig Trouble. This is going to give you Bert Jepson and Gracie. Both are mid-range models. Gracie can help move other models up the table, particularly the first mate, so he can go even farther and deeper into the backfield. And then Bert Jepson is a reckless model with 3 AP, which also can make him pretty fast. He has some decent attacks, so another decent mid-range model. Going from there, you have When Pigs Fly. This gives you Maris and 3 flying piglets. Maris is mostly a schemer, so you're taking her for her ability to drop a lot of scheme markers in a hurry. Plus, she's pretty fast because she also has a jetpack like her boyfriend Zip. Then, of course, we have Hodgepodge Fate for the Emissary. We've gone over this several times. It's just a great expensive support piece. Going into the orange boxes, we have Paid in Blood because Midnight Stalker is just a really good deep field piece. And Zip tends to be taken in more schemy pools, so it's going to give you a really fast crew that can get the entire crew up the field really quickly. Hans is okay if you want to keep back somebody to snipe. Probably not the main pick for this, though. Then you have a hard day's work. This gives you Johann and Prospectors. The Prospectors are probably the main reason you're going to take this, just because they can generate soulstones, so you can start with a lower cache and a Prospector and create more soulstones as the game goes on. It can also do a small lure and draw some cards, and most of the time it just stays in the backfield and generates resources for you. Johann is an okay piece. The problem is he's only a stat 5 with a min 3, so a lot of times he's just going to whiff, and he's not particularly tough, but he is a model that does benefit from all the fly with me's and Gracie's being able to ride with me, that sort of stuff, so you can yank him up the board and he can just hit something, and he's not terribly expensive for doing min 3. And again, we have the Bayou Smugglers in red. Even though they are an infamous keyword, they're just not particularly great, and I don't think they really do anything this crew can't do with other models, but you may get value out of them if you want to do some interesting, like, scheme marker moving tricks. For the Mercenary keyword, we of course have the Victorias. Then we start with Loyalty to Coin. This is going to give you the Student of Conflict, who can make other models fast. Gives you Big Jake, who has a interesting demise ability where when he dies, he buries, and then at any point in the game, he can come back out. And he also is a Don't Mind Me piece, so it gives you a little bit of scheminess that you can do. And then you have Taylor, who's kind of a beater / anti-summoner. Granted, her ability, because of how it's worded, it's not as anti-summoning as it initially appears to be, because they have to place the model in front of you. And there are some summoners that their mechanics just get around that because of how they summon. So take her as a beater primarily, because she does do min 3, she is stat 7, so she can hit fairly hard. She's not incredibly tough, but with soulstones you can keep her up. Moving from there, of course, we have the Emissary, as with all Outcast boxes, just a great piece. Then you have the starter box. Again, you're taking this for the Brawler. Now, as I said before, the Brawler is subject to change as of time of recording, but if his card stays the same, he is a great piece for this. And the other models, again, are fine, but the Brawler is the reason you want to take this, because he gives some tankiness to this crew, and the Vics really need tankiness. He can actually help keep them alive by staying around them. And then, of course, you have Paid in Blood for Midnight Stalker, another backfield piece. As usual, very common take in Outcast in general. And then Hans, if you need a sniper and the table is open for it, he is a decent piece to be able to disrupt the enemies. The final Mercenary box, Hired Killers, is red because these models aren't particularly great. The Desperate Merc is okay. It's pretty cheap model, but it is what its cost is. It's just low statted. Bishop looks decent, but the problem with Bishop is he has a 0-inch engagement and doesn't have slippery, which kind of fixes that problem for some of the newer models. He's an older model that doesn't have it. So you're going to find that a lot of times people just engage him at 1 inch and he becomes a 2 AP model. Normally he'd be 3 AP because of his abilities. He just loses a lot of what you're paying for because he has a 0-inch reach. So until he gets fixed, I wouldn't bother with him. For Obliteration, you're going to start with Terra's core box. Then you're going to get Servants of the Void and Beyond Time. Beyond Time is your big models, so it gives you Aeonius, who is a fantastic support piece, although he can hit as well. He is integral, though, because Terra's a summoner and summons in Buried. Aeonius is one of those ways to be able to pull those unburied models back out. He can also create pass tokens, which is something very few models in the game can do. And you can abuse those pass tokens by making the opponent go with all of their models first, and then you can do multiple activations in a row. Then Talos recently got a buff, so make sure you grab his newest card. He is now a pretty solid beater, whereas previously he couldn't hit buried models. Now you can bury things and he can punch them for min 3. And he just got some added toughness, so he's a little bit better overall. The Servants of the Void box you're buying primarily for the Void Hunters because you want to be summoning them because they're your better summon. The Scion gives you an interesting kind of tricky model because he buries himself and then attacks through your other models. He can, of course, attack buried models, and he has some condition removal, both offensive and defensive, depending on how you want to use it. He's an interesting tech piece that you can bring in. Expanding from there, you of course have the Emissary, who is just, again, as we've said many times, a great support piece. And that's really all you need for Terra. She's very self-contained, probably the most self-contained of all the masters. For the Plague keyword, you start with Hamlin's core box, and then of course get Brotherhood of the Rat. This gives you extra rats, which you're going to need. You do tend to have a lot of rats on the table. It gives you the rat catchers, which are great models. They actually hit surprisingly hard once things have blight on them. Plus, they have Don't Mind Me. And they also can be replaced into depending on where your Rat Kings are, so you'll want the piece. Rat King themselves are a good mid-range hitter model. They're your primary summon, if you want to call it that. Basically, you're bringing all these rats out and then you're forming into Rat Kings, which then can form into Rat Catchers as need be. It's a little bit more of a complicated crew, but you definitely need all these models in order to do their tricks. Now, the starting list is a little wonky. You're probably not actually going to start this way once you get a little more advanced, but this is how I'm going to recommend for starting players to build their list. Once you are familiar with the mechanics, then you can start with a bunch of rats and then do the focusing with the rats and then forming into Rat Kings and that sort of thing. It's more efficient to do it that way and you get a lot more value out of it, but it's a little complicated for new players to start that route. I think this is an easier list to start with. Then, of course, if you want to expand from these base boxes, there's Tainted Filth. This gives you Benny and the Winged Plagues. Benny you'll want for the more complicated starting game because he's part of that process, because he can turn scheme markers into rats. So a lot of times you're dropping scheme markers and turning them into a bunch of rats and then turning a bunch of rats into Rat Kings, etc., etc., etc. The Winged Plagues are kind of terrible, so you probably aren't going to bring them. They don't work the way I think they're supposed to work. Moving from there, you have Paid in Blood. Mostly for the Midnight Stalker because you need a backfield schemer and you don't really have one, so he is what you got, so you take him. Hans is okay, you're probably not going to take him so much. And then finally, in the orange options, you have, of course, the Emissary because the Emissary is a great piece. A little less necessary because this crew tends to be a little more self-contained overall. It's usually keyword and stalkers. Most times I've seen it on the table, but the Emissary does give you some extra utility if you're interested in that. For Tormented, we of course start with the Jackdaw box, and then we have some question marks. So there's a couple ways to build this. The first way is the recommended way. Unfortunately, there is no M3E box for these models. And it's not even an upcoming box. They just don't exist as of right now, which I think is an oversight on Weird's part. But I assume that these models would be packaged together. It'll probably be about $40 would be my guess. But as of right now, you have to go find the M2E versions of the Hanged. In that case, I wouldn't bother with the Crooked Men. Just find the M2E boxes of the Hanged. Those together will give you your initial list. This is a pretty decent DAW list. I mean, it's not that far off of what you would normally take anyways. So it's a good starting package if you buy those. Expanding from there, you can get Jakuna, who gives you a great lure and some hazardous train tricks. It gives you 3 Drowned, which are okay, cheaper models. They're point fillers and they're fairly tough overall. And then you can expand from there into the Dead Outlaws, which can make things fast. A lot of times you are going to be using these guys to make like Monty fast, potentially a Hanged fast, but whatever you need to. And they're fairly well costed for what they do. It also gives you Run and Gun as well. Of course, finally, as an orange option, there's always the Emissary, because just a great piece. Now, if for whatever reason you're not able to get a hold of the Hanged, you can't find the old M2E boxes or even the M1E box for that matter, then you can go with Jakuna first and then build a little bit different of a list. Not probably as ideal of a starting list, but it's alright. And then, of course, you'll want to get the Hanged from there because they are basically one of the signature pieces of Jackdaw. So you're going to have to hunt that box down or wait for it if you're waiting for the M3E boxes. And the rest of my recommendations are the same as the first set of boxes, so Outlaws, then the Emissary. And that does it for this episode. Thank you for watching as always, and stay tuned for the other factions that will be coming out in the upcoming weeks.